In January of 1963, a 21-year-old doctoral student at Cambridge tripped on a patch of ice and fell. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody stopped. He got up, brushed himself off, and walked to his next lecture. But something had been wrong for months. The stumbling, the occasional slurring, the way his hands sometimes refused to cooperate with what his brain was telling them. A few weeks later, doctors gave him the diagnosis: motor neuron disease, a death sentence delivered with clinical calm. They told him he had 2 years, maybe 3. He was 21 years old. What happened next is one of the most contested, complicated, and misrepresented stories in modern history, not because of what the disease did to him, but because of what he did with the disease. Stephen William Hawking was born on January 8, 1942 in Oxford, England. He liked to note, with characteristic precision, that this was exactly 300 years after the death of Galileo. Whether this was coincidence or mythology, Hawking understood instinctively, almost from the beginning, that a scientist's life needs a story. His father, Frank Hawking, was a research biologist, serious, cerebral, absent in the way that highly intelligent men of that era tended to be absent. His mother, Isabel, was unusual for her time, opinionated, intellectual, politically active. The family was eccentric by English middle-class standards. They drove a converted London taxi, they kept bees, they read at the dinner table in silence. Stephen was not, by most accounts, a prodigy in the obvious sense. His schoolwork was unremarkable until his mid-teens. He was social, popular even, but not the kind of student whose teachers immediately identified him as destined for greatness. He was clever, he was lazy, he had a talent for finding shortcuts. What he had in abundance was intuition, the ability to see the shape of a problem without working through every step, to know the answer before he could prove it. This is not uncommon in mathematics, but in Hawking, it was extreme enough that his fellow students at Oxford later remembered it with a mixture of admiration and slight unease. He arrived at Oxford in 1959, at 17. He studied physics. He was bored for most of it. The culture at Oxford at the time rewarded a particular kind of easy brilliance, doing as little as possible while maintaining the illusion of effortless mastery. Hawking fit this culture perfectly. Then he went to Cambridge, and everything changed. To understand what Cambridge in the early 1960s meant for a young physicist, you have to understand what physics itself was at that moment. The century had already been extraordinary. Einstein had rewritten gravity. Quantum mechanics had shattered the intuitive universe. The atom had been split. The bomb had fallen. But there was a frontier that remained almost completely unexplored, the very large and the very fast, the universe at its most extreme scales. General relativity, Einstein's theory of how gravity shapes spacetime, had been published in 1915. Nearly 50 years later, its deepest implications were still not fully understood. What happens to spacetime at the center of a black hole? What was the universe like at the very first instant of its existence? Can a theory of physics explain not just how the universe works, but why it exists at all? These were not fringe questions. They were the central, unanswered problems of theoretical physics. And in the early 1960s, the field was beginning to attract its first serious modern attention. The term black hole didn't even exist yet. It was coined in 1967 by physicist John Wheeler. In 1963, these objects were called gravitationally collapsed stars, and most physicists treated them as interesting mathematical curiosities rather than things that actually existed in the real universe. Hawking arrived at Cambridge to study cosmology under Fred Hoyle, one of the most famous astronomers in Britain. He didn't get Hoyle, he got Dennis Sciama instead. It was, arguably, the luckiest accident of his life. Sciama was not as famous as Hoyle, but he was a better supervisor for Hawking, more rigorous, more generous with his time, more focused on the questions that would matter. Sciama pushed Hawking toward the work of Roger Penrose, a mathematician at Oxford who was developing new tools for thinking about singularities, the points where space-time breaks down. The intellectual environment was electric, and then the ice, and then the fall, and then the diagnosis. 2 years. The doctors said 2 years. The first year after the diagnosis, Hawking later wrote, was largely spent in depression. This is almost never mentioned in the standard retellings. The inspirational version of the story begins almost immediately with transformation, with the young physicist finding purpose through adversity, falling in love, deciding to live. And all of that is true, but the depression was real first. The darkness was real first. He had been given a death sentence at 21 before he had done anything significant, before he had proven what he suspected about himself, that he was not merely clever, that he was genuinely great. The diagnosis could have ended the story there. What changed things, and Hawking said this explicitly more than once, was Jane Wilde. He had met her briefly before the diagnosis, a language student, dark-haired, serious, quietly confident. After the diagnosis, he ran into her again at a New Year's party. Something shifted. The decision to pursue the relationship was also, for Hawking, a decision to fight. Not out of sentimentality, out of pure mechanism. He could not marry Jane without having a job, and he could not get a job without a PhD, and he could not get a PhD without finishing his thesis, and he could not finish his thesis without doing serious intellectual work. She gave him a reason. The reason gave him structure. The structure gave him a thesis. It is worth pausing on this because it is the part of the story that gets most sentimentalized and, in the sentimentalizing, most distorted. Jane did not save Stephen Hawking by loving him unconditionally. Jane saved Stephen Hawking by being a specific kind of person, demanding, faithful, deeply Christian, with a moral framework that did not allow her to abandon someone she had committed to, even as that commitment became something close to full-time caregiving. This was not simple. This was not easy. This was, for Jane Wilde, a kind of martyrdom she accepted with open eyes and came to resent more deeply than almost anyone understood at the time. But we will return to that. His thesis was on cosmology, specifically on the nature of singularities in general relativity. Using the mathematical tools developed by Penrose, Hawking began to prove something that seemed almost philosophically outrageous. If general relativity is correct, and if the universe has been expanding, as Edwin Hubble's observations had confirmed, then run the expansion backwards. Play the film in reverse. The galaxies contract. The distances shrink. Everything compresses, down to a point, down to a singularity. The universe itself, Hawking's work suggested, began in a singularity, a point of infinite density, infinite temperature, infinite curvature of space-time. The Big Bang, a term coined sarcastically by Fred Hoyle, who didn't believe it, was not just an astronomical event. It was a boundary, a moment before which the ordinary laws of physics did not apply, or possibly did not exist at all. This was significant. This was more than significant. This was the kind of result that could anchor a career. He completed his PhD in 1966. He won the prestigious Adams Prize that same year for an essay on singularities. The disease was progressing. He was using a walking stick by the time he finished his degree. His speech was beginning to slur, not yet incomprehensibly, but noticeably. The physical deterioration that would eventually consume his body entirely was already underway. And yet, the work was accelerating. In the late 1960s and into the 1970s, Hawking became part of a small, intensely collaborative group of physicists and mathematicians, Penrose, Brandon Carter, James Bardeen, Werner Israel, who were collectively building the modern theory of black holes. What they produced in this period is, in the opinion of most serious physicists, the most important body of theoretical work that Hawking ever did. The singularity theorems, the area theorem, proving that the total surface area of black holes can never decrease. The 4 laws of black hole mechanics, which map eerily onto the 4 laws of thermodynamics. These were not popular science results. They were not designed for an audience. They were rigorous, technical, and deeply beautiful. The kind of work that other physicists read and feel a particular kind of envy that is really admiration. Then, in 1974, came the result that would make him famous: Hawking radiation. Black holes, the classical theory said, were black. Nothing escaped. That was the definition. The event horizon, the point of no return, was absolute. Hawking showed this was wrong. Using a fusion of general relativity and quantum field theory, the two great frameworks of 20th century physics that nobody had yet managed to unite, he demonstrated that black holes must emit radiation. Slowly, thermally. Over time, they must lose mass. They must evaporate. A black hole is not eternal. It dies. This was not just an interesting result. It was a fundamental insight into the nature of spacetime, thermodynamics, and quantum mechanics. It planted a seed that is still growing, the information paradox. The question of what happens to information inside a black hole as it evaporates remains one of the deepest unsolved problems in all of physics. Hawking was 32 years old. He was using a wheelchair full-time, and he had just written his name into the permanent record of science. Here is where the story becomes complicated, and here is where most biographies, most documentaries, most tributes either look away or pass through quickly or smooth over the edges until the rough truth becomes a palatable myth. The 1970s were, professionally, the peak of Hawking's career. The papers he produced in this decade, culminating in Hawking radiation, represent his deepest and most lasting contribution to physics. In the judgment of colleagues who worked alongside him, including many who admired him enormously, the work of this period was genuinely Nobel-worthy. He never received a Nobel Prize. This is a fact that requires examination, not because it represents injustice. The Nobel Committee has specific rules about experimental verification, and Hawking radiation has never been directly observed. But because of how Hawking processed this absence, how it shaped his subsequent choices, how it drove him, in ways that his closest colleagues would acknowledge only obliquely, toward something other than pure science, toward fame. The contract for A Brief History of Time was signed in 1982. The book was published in 1988. It spent 4 years on the Sunday Times bestseller list. It sold more than 10 million copies. It turned Stephen Hawking into the most famous scientist on Earth, more famous than any living physicist, more recognizable than almost any living intellectual. And here's the thing that needs to be said clearly, without cruelty, but without evasion. A Brief History of Time is not a great scientific book. It is a great popular book. It is well written for its era. It captures genuine excitement about the biggest questions in physics, but it is also, in significant ways, misleading. It presents the state of physics in 1988 as more settled, more linear, more comprehensible than it actually was. It popularizes Hawking's own work in ways that, in the opinion of several of his peers, overstate its definitiveness. Roger Penrose, whose mathematical work was foundational to Hawking's singularity theorems, who worked alongside Hawking for decades, has been pointedly ambivalent about Hawking's legacy in interviews. Not hostile, but careful. The kind of careful that says something. Kip Thorne, the Caltech physicist who was one of Hawking's closest friends and scientific collaborators, has written warmly about him. But even Thorne's warm account draws a careful distinction between the Hawking of the 1970s, the physicist of extraordinary insight, and the Hawking who emerged after the fame. The Hawking who made bets, who issued press releases about his theories, who appeared on Star Trek, who allowed himself to be positioned as the oracle of the cosmos. This is not a verdict on his character. It is an observation about the specific collision between extraordinary talent and extraordinary circumstance. Hawking understood something that most scientists don't allow themselves to understand, that science, like everything else in modern society, operates in an attention economy. That the person who shapes the story of physics for the general public becomes, in a real sense, more powerful than the person who does the most rigorous work. He chose to shape the story. Meanwhile, at home, the marriage to Jane was fracturing, slowly, over years, in the way that structural damage occurs, invisible until it isn't. Jane had spent the decade and a half since their marriage doing something that is almost impossible to describe without sounding either saintly or tragic. She had been simultaneously Stephen's intellectual partner, primary caregiver, mother of their 3 children, and a woman with her own academic ambitions. Her PhD in medieval Spanish literature, which she completed in 1981, that were perpetually subordinated to the requirements of his disease and his career. As his physical condition deteriorated and his fame expanded, the practical demands of his care became overwhelming. The family had live-in nurses. There were graduate students rotating through the household as assistants. The domestic architecture of their lives was organized entirely around him. Jane later wrote about this period in her memoir, first published in 1999, then revised and expanded in 2013 as Traveling to Infinity, with an honesty that the public, by and large, chose not to absorb. She describes the isolation, the loneliness of being permanently secondary in your own home, the way Stephen's certainty, his total, uncompromising confidence in his own judgments, could function as a kind of emotional aggression, not physical aggression, not cruelty in any obvious sense, but the slow weight of being with someone who has decided, perhaps necessarily, perhaps as a mechanism of survival, that his needs are the ones that matter. She also describes something else. The faith that sustained her, her Christianity, deep and practiced, was something Stephen found not just alien, but faintly contemptible. He was a committed atheist, or more precisely, a committed dismisser of the question. The universe, he believed, had no need of a creator. This was not merely a philosophical position for him, it was a kind of identity. And it meant that the thing Jane needed most, the framework that made her extraordinary sacrifice bearable, was the thing he most openly disdained. There is a recording of a BBC interview from the mid-1980s in which Jane is asked, quietly, how she manages. She pauses. She smiles. She says something careful and composed. And if you watch closely, there is a moment, just a moment, where the composure is not quite complete. Let us talk about what is not in the documentaries. In 1985, Stephen Hawking contracted pneumonia while visiting CERN in Geneva. The illness was severe enough that doctors asked Jane to consider withdrawing life support. She refused. He survived. But the tracheotomy that saved his life took the last of his natural voice. Before 1985, Hawking's speech had been deteriorating for years, slow, slurred, difficult to understand without practice. After 1985, it was gone entirely. He communicated through a computer speech synthesizer, first operated through hand controls, then, as the disease progressed, through cheek muscle movements and eventually eye-tracking technology. The iconic voice, the flat, slightly robotic American-accented synthesizer, became, paradoxically, his most recognizable feature. He was offered a voice with a British accent. He declined. The American-accented synthesizer had become him. He had become it. To change it would be, in some sense he acknowledged openly, to lose a piece of his identity. This is one of the most psychologically revealing things about Hawking that is almost never discussed. The synthesis of man and machine that his disease forced upon him produced, in Hawking, not resistance, but a kind of embrace. He leaned into it. The wheelchair, the synthesizer, the stillness, these were not obstacles to his public presence. They were his public presence. They were the visual and sonic grammar through which the world understood him. And here is the hard question. Did this serve him, or did it trap him? The trapped version. The synthesizer, the chair, the iconic silhouette, these things made it impossible for the world to see him as a complicated human being. They saw a symbol. They saw a mind in a machine, a soul in a cage, a triumph of intellect over matter. This is a beautiful story. It is also, in its totality, a dehumanizing one. It reduces a person to a category, and Hawking, who was in many ways a deeply vain man, not in a small or trivial sense, but in the way that people who have been told they are exceptional often are, may have accepted this reduction because the alternative, being seen fully, was more threatening. Being seen fully would have meant being seen as the man who, in the early 1990s, left his wife of 25 years for his own nurse. Her name was Elaine Mason. She had been part of the nursing team caring for him since the late 1980s. She was direct, forceful, dramatically different from Jane in temperament and manner. Where Jane was measured, Elaine was volatile. Where Jane had built her life around self-suppression, Elaine, colleagues and friends noted, was expansive. Hawking and Elaine Mason married in 1995. The marriage lasted 11 years. During those years, there were reports. His personal assistants raised concerns about his physical welfare. There were injuries, bruises, broken bones, that nursing staff and assistants documented and reported, in some cases, to police. An investigation was conducted by Cambridgeshire Police. It was closed without charges. What happened exactly in those years is not known. What is known is that his children, Robert, Lucy, and Timothy, were essentially estranged from him during the marriage to Elaine. That colleagues who attempted to raise welfare concerns were pushed out. That the man at the center of the situation communicated to anyone who expressed concern that he was perfectly fine, that he could manage his own affairs, that he resented the implication otherwise. This last part is where it becomes philosophically difficult, because Hawking's insistence on his own autonomy, his absolute refusal to be managed, to be looked after against his will, to have his decisions questioned on the grounds that he was vulnerable, was both entirely legitimate and potentially self-destructive. He had spent 50 years refusing to be defined by his disability. The cost of that refusal was that he also, sometimes, refused the protections that disability legitimately requires. The marriage to Elaine ended in 2006. He never remarried. In his final years, he was closer again to Jane, to his children, to the life he had walked away from. But there is something else in this period that demands attention: the physics. After the mid-1980s, after a brief history of time, after the fame, after the machine of his public image began running at full speed, Hawking's scientific output changed. It did not stop. He continued to publish. He continued to engage with the deepest questions. But the quality shifted. The results became, in the assessment of specialists, less rigorous, more speculative, more dependent on intuition, and less grounded in the kind of careful mathematical argument that had made the 1970s work so powerful. He became, in a sense, a prophet rather than a theorist. He spoke about black holes, about the information paradox, about quantum cosmology, about the origin of the universe. But increasingly, he was doing so in the mode of a visionary, issuing proclamations that his colleagues would then have to either verify or discard. The most famous example is the information paradox. In 1997, he made a famous bet with Kip Thorne against John Preskill, that information falling into a black hole is permanently lost. It was the kind of bet that makes good copy. It was talked about in newspapers, in magazines, in documentaries. In 2004, Hawking announced, at a conference, to the press, that he had solved the paradox, that information is not lost, that he was conceding the bet. His solution was widely dismissed by the physicists who studied the problem most carefully. The argument was incomplete. The mathematical underpinning was, in the judgment of people like Juan Maldacena, who had done rigorous work on the subject, not convincing. Hawking presented his concession as a breakthrough. The press reported it as a breakthrough. The scientific community largely set it aside. This is the pattern, the prophet mode. The announcement made to journalists before the peer review. The bet conceded with fanfare. The icon of science providing the world with the story it wanted, regardless of whether the underlying work was complete. It is not fraud. It is not dishonesty in any simple sense. It is the specific distortion that fame produces in a scientist who has become, above all else, a symbol. In the last decade of his life, Hawking did something that surprised even people who thought they knew him well. He became a warning. Not about physics, not about the universe, about the future of humanity itself. The Stephen Hawking of the 2000s spoke with increasing urgency about artificial intelligence, about genetic engineering, about the colonization of Mars, about the possibility, he considered it close to a certainty, that humanity would not survive the century if it remained confined to a single planet. He became, in other words, an existential prophet. And the world, which had long since decided what Hawking was, received these warnings with a kind of affectionate condescension. The great cosmologist, speaking from his chair, warning us about the future. It made excellent content. It made excellent press. It fit perfectly into the visual grammar of his mythology. The brilliant man immobilized by his body, unshackled in his imagination, casting his gaze forward across centuries. What it did not produce was serious policy engagement, because there is a specific problem with becoming a symbol. A symbol can be admired. A symbol can be loved. A symbol can even, sometimes, move people emotionally. But a symbol cannot be argued with, cannot be questioned, cannot participate in the messy, iterative, boring, essential process by which science actually advances. In his final years, Hawking was more famous than almost any scientist in history. He appeared on chat shows. His image appeared on posters and t-shirts. He had a cameo in The Simpsons. His voice appeared in Pink Floyd recordings. And the physics community, quietly, without malice, had largely moved on. The questions he had helped open in the 1970s, the deep questions about singularities, black holes, quantum gravity, were being answered, or not answered, by a new generation of physicists. People like Maldacena, like Andrew Strominger, like Nima Arkani Hamed. Physicists working at a technical level of sophistication that the Hawking of the 2000s, his capacity for extended mathematical calculations severely limited by the progression of his disease, could not fully engage with. He knew this. This is important. He knew it. There is an account, given by one of his long-term collaborators, of Hawking in his last years asking to be read recent papers on the information paradox, papers dense with the mathematical machinery of holography and string theory, asking for summaries, asking what had been found. The image this produces is specific and almost unbearable. The man who had opened some of these questions, now at the edge of them, unable to cross, being told what was on the other side. He died on March 14, 2018. It was, by coincidence or the universe's sense of humor, Pi Day, the 14th of the third month, and the birthday of Albert Einstein. He had been told, in 1963, that he had 2 years to live. He lived for 55 more years. The motor neuron disease that should have killed him at 23 killed him instead at 76. The reason for this, why Hawking survived so far beyond any reasonable medical expectation, is genuinely not understood. His case was medically extraordinary, and not just biographically. He had a form of ALS that progressed with unusual slowness, for reasons that neurologists have not been able to fully explain. In this, as in so much else, he was an outlier. In his will, he left the majority of his estate to his children. His scientific papers went to Cambridge. His wheelchair, his personal copy of his thesis, his office door from the Applied Mathematics and Theoretical Physics building, these were acquired by the Science Museum in London. The voice synthesizer is in the Smithsonian. How is Stephen Hawking remembered? Easily. Too easily. The image is fixed. The wheelchair, the synthesizer, the slightly tilted head, the eyes, alert, amused, sometimes visibly impatient. The man who decoded the universe while his body fell away, the mind that refused imprisonment, the triumph of the human spirit. It is a beautiful image. It is also, in important ways, a lie. Not in the sense of being false, but in the sense of being incomplete in a way that serves the lie's function. It gives us permission not to look. The real Hawking was a man of genuine and significant scientific contribution, most of it concentrated in a decade of extraordinary work, produced in the specific circumstances of early disability, intellectual excitement, and personal terror. The singularity theorems, Hawking radiation, the 4 laws of black hole mechanics, these are real. These matter. They will be in the textbooks for as long as there are textbooks. But the real Hawking was also a man who, understandably, perhaps inevitably, allowed the machinery of his fame to become more important than the machinery of his science, who chose the role of oracle over the harder, quieter work of remaining rigorous, who understood the attention economy of modern intellectual life with a shrewdness that made some colleagues admire him and others, quietly, despair. He was a man who treated the woman who kept him alive for 25 years with a complexity of feeling that we would not accept from someone who was not in a wheelchair, who entered a second marriage whose circumstances the world agreed, by silent mutual consent, not to examine too carefully, because the image could not absorb it. He was a man who was terrified of death, despite what the interviews suggest, despite the serene public face, and who used the energy of that terror productively for decades before eventually having to confront it. What does his story reveal? Several things, none of them simple. It reveals how much of what we call inspiration is actually projection. We looked at Stephen Hawking and saw what we needed to see, that the mind is free, that the body is just a container, that the right attitude can overcome anything. We needed this. We needed it badly enough that we made him a symbol before we finished making him a person. It reveals something about disability and mythology. The way that a person who is visibly, dramatically disabled becomes, in the public imagination, not quite human, or rather, not human in the ordinary, messy, complicated sense, but human in the elevated sense of the icon, the saint, the exemplar. This is not kindness. It is a form of erasure. It reveals something about science and celebrity, about what happens to a scientist who becomes famous in the way that actors and politicians are famous. The career incentives diverge from the scientific incentives. The press conference becomes more important than the proof. The announcement outpaces the argument. And it reveals something, perhaps most importantly, about what illness does to a life. Not what we think it does, not the inspirational narrative, something harder. Hawking's disease removed things from him, gradually, mercilessly, over 55 years. It removed his mobility, his speech, his independence, his ability to write, to move, to raise his children in the ordinary physical way. It caused suffering that he managed, largely, to keep out of public view. But it also gave him something, not the gift the mythology describes, not pure, transcendent liberation of the mind. It gave him permission. Permission to be demanding, permission to be difficult, permission to receive without reciprocating, permission to be certain, permission to be enormous. Because who argues with a man in a wheelchair? Who tells him he's wrong? Who holds him accountable in the ordinary way that human beings hold each other accountable? The disease did not just liberate Hawking's mind from his body, it liberated him from certain social obligations. And like all liberations, this one had costs, paid mostly by the people around him. In 1988, in the introduction to A Brief History of Time, Hawking wrote that if we ever found a complete unified theory of physics, a single equation that described everything, then we would know the mind of God. He did not believe in God. He said so often, but he believed in the question. He spent his life in the presence of the largest questions the human mind can hold. What is space? What is time? What happened before the beginning? Is there a before? He didn't answer them. Nobody has. Perhaps nobody will. But he sat with them, in that chair, in that stillness, in that particular silence that was not emptiness, but attention, for 55 years after the doctor said his time was up. The universe is approximately 13.8 billion years old. The stretch of a single human life against that, even a long one, even a famous one, is less than a rounding error. And yet, we remember him. We argue about him. We are, still, arguing about what he meant. That is not nothing. Maybe that's the answer, not to the question of the universe, but to the smaller, harder question of what a life is for.